Right, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and welcome you all here to ASPI. I'm Justin Bassi, the head of ASPI. It's an absolute pleasure. Welcome to this discussion on the Quad, hopefully a bit of a debate on the Quad. It should be an excellent discussion given who we've got here with us today. The Quad has died once before. And some are saying that it may once again have done so, or at least be in peril. I'm personally more bullish on the Quad. Tensions bilaterally amongst Quad countries are different in my view to when we have tensions with authoritarian regimes, because there is a foundation of alignment on the long-term threats that we face. We've just heard this morning that AUKUS might be given the green light by the Trump administration. That is excellent news. It's a partnership that is good, that is great for all three partners. But it shows that debates can occur, that disagreements at a national level can take place, but there are crucial areas that bind us and that they are long-lasting. Some say that because India is not an ally, unlike the other three, it makes it different, the Quad different to the alliance or to AUKUS. But again, I actually think that if you look at NATO, we see significant debate amongst NATO allies on its role, on core aspects, on spending, but the foundations, the commitment to NATO are only reinforced. I think that's the same case with the Quad. But is it? Or is it the fact, is it more that the Quad has always been personality-based rather than substance? So to discuss these issues, we really do have an esteemed panel. We have Japan's ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Kazuhiro Suzuki. Welcome, thank you very much. We've got the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the US Studies Centre, Dr. Lavina. We have Dr. Arzan Tarapore from Stanford University Centre for International Security and Cooperation, and we have ASPI's Senior Resident Fellow, Raji Rajagopalan, all long-time Quad and regional experts. Quick note on the format. I'll take the panel through a few questions, around about 30 minutes or so, and then I'll throw open to the audience to see if there are questions from you guys. So start thinking as you hear the panellists speaking. I'll start with a question for all of the panel. We'll go down the line. As I talked, as I mentioned, that the Quad has gone through some ups and downs. For 10 years, between 2007 and 2017, it was effectively in hibernation. The convergence of the strategic interests of the four nations brought it back into life from 2017. Right now, there are some tensions between Delhi and DC, some tensions between Canberra and DC. So has the Quad become a permanent feature that will outlast these temporary issues? Or are any of the panellists a bit worried that the bilateral tensions could spell the second death of the Quad? Ambassador, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Justin, for having me here today. And before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. This is my first time speaking about Quad in public, so let me start by saying how Japan sees the Quad in our foreign policy. As we see in Ukraine and the Middle East, today's international situation has become more and more severe. Trust in a global rule of law, once taken for granted, is weakening. So in this context, Japan promotes the vision of a free and open Indo Pacific, FOIP, and the FOIP seeks to safeguard and advance the international order based on the rule of law. For Japan, the Quad is the framework to turn this vision into practical cooperation. And to realize this, confidence building and partnership with ASEAN and other regional members and the forums are essential. Japan has always respected ASEAN's initiatives. We emphasized the real and pragmatic outcomes to create stable, inclusive, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. The Quad has always positioned itself as a force for good. And coming to your question, Justin, of the Quad future, I know there are some doubts about U.S. commitment and concerns about U.S.-India relations, but note this, there were already 2 Quad foreign ministers meetings during the first 6 months of the Trump administration. This is a clear message that Quad continues to play an important role in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad is a group of maritime democracies that share core values. Of course, bilateral frictions may arise. Japan itself had a severe trade friction with the United States in the 1990s. Yet at the same time, our security partnership was deepening. So in the long run, the fundamental values that unite us are stronger than the individual disputes that divide us. And I hope differences between India and the United States will be resolved through various contacts and discussion, including the Quad process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. I do think I agree with you in terms of you use the word values. I think it's often we tend to forget in a world of interests how important those values are, and I think they do definitely bind the Quad nations. Raji, what about you? Do you see these temporary issues as more problematic than the ambassador does, or do you see the Quad now as having a permanent foothold?
No, thank you, Justin. And no, my sense is that I think the Quad is going to somehow come out of this successfully. It's a turbulent phase that is going through, but the temporary turbulence is not to mean that this is going to sort of wither away in a sense. And I'll give you the case, for instance, what are India's options in a sense when it comes to managing or addressing India's critical national security threats? When India has clearly acknowledged China as the #1 national security threats, its options are fairly limited. So especially during the last 2 months, I think India has also come to recognize that its options are limited. The US and the US-related US allied partnerships, friendships, those are very, very critical in managing China in a sense. India might do some posturing with Russia and China, as we did see recently during the SCO summit in China. But I think they are more for show. And if you actually look at the Indian response to Trump's imposition of additional tariff for Indian purchase of Russian oil, India's response has been fairly muted, very considered, very calibrated, very nuanced approach India has taken so far to say this is unfair, this is uncalled for, but India has not really lashed on to the on these 2 comments. So I think India does recognize that India still needs the US and US partnerships, and the Quad has an important role to play. But again and again, I always talk about how India and the other Quad countries, we are all a group of democracies. We are messy, we are loud, messy, confusing, chaotic democracies. From time to time, there are going to be these turbulent phases that we will go through, but that temporary phase, temporary disruptions do not necessarily mean this is going to be the end of the Quad in a sense. Having said that, between 2007 and 2017, I just want to go back to it. I think the Quad came back in a second avatar because the threats and challenges that brought initial Quad into place, that had intensified quite a bit over that particular 1 decade. But having said that, during this from 2017 to now, when you look at it, the Quad has also become quite expansive, looking at mostly non-security issues in a sense. And I think that's, to me, is a bit of a problem. I'm not against doing tech or health issues, pandemic-related health contingencies and all of that. But at the same time, if you continue to sort of not really look at have a focus on this security aspects, then you are actually forgetting the primary rationale of the Quad coming into play. And that was to counter China. And I think that's where my problem is. The individual or bilateral problems that we continue to see from time to time in the bilateral relations, I don't think they are going to be a permanent setback for the Quad itself. But I think having that clarity in terms of what the focus should be for the Quad, I think that's for me more important.
Thanks, Raji. Temporary turbulence, but needing to actually not forget what the role of the Quad is. Lavina?
So you started off the panel with a debate about the Quad. Unfortunately, I'm in agreement. So from my perspective, you see two major problems. One is the Trump administration seems to be very equivocal about alliances. So on the one hand, it is putting pressure on allies to step up, to share burdens. So in a sense, it is affirming the importance of alliances, but that allies aren't contributing enough. So that's potentially a good thing. The second part of it is that the America First agenda can play havoc with these alliances. So when it comes to the problems that we're seeing with the Indians, I see that as being part of that America First agenda. But I would agree with Raji that if you look at the long-term trajectory, one, India doesn't have other choices. It has a trust problem with the United States that has emerged very recently, but it has a very deep trust problem with China that I don't think is going to be able to be resolved anytime soon. If I think, Raji, you would agree with me. So I think there's more scope for the relationship with the United States to mend itself. There will be a negotiation. There is already ongoing negotiations. I think we can overcome that. I think the third factor I would mention is just that we have a strategic balance that is in flux here in the region. So the United States is, I think, still thinking that it can compete. That's why it's pressuring its allies to do more. It is focused on the Indo Pacific, and the Quad is a very important vehicle that's already established that is, or could be, fit for purpose in that competition with China. So I would agree with Raji that up till now, I think the agenda of the Quad has been too broad and not deep enough, and it's not been strategic enough. Remembering its original purpose, the reason for the existence of the Quad is that there is a competition going on for the Indo Pacific, and the Quad has been too reticent to tackle that head on.
It's very interesting, Lavina. A slightly separate topic. We had Stephen Lovegrove in here a few weeks now who was implying that he thought an issue with AUKUS Pillar 2 was that it had become too broad as well, and it needed to come back to... I do like your thesis that the US expects more from partners, and that's a positive, because if they didn't care, they wouldn't ask at all. It's a very good message. Arzan, are we in agreement?
Yeah. I mean, it's good and bad, right? I mean, my tone is because, you know, I'm sorry to be in furious agreement, but I'm in furious. We wouldn't be here if we weren't in furious agreement on this fundamental point, right? The fundamental point is that this is not the demise of the Quad. It's for all the reasons that we've discussed. There's a rough patch. There's problems. Yes, got it. Is a problem, but the Quad has evolved in the past, and it has capacity to keep evolving, to evolve further. And what do I mean by this? When it was resuscitated in 2017, it began at officials levels, at the margins of a multilateral meeting, and that sort of behind closed doors, very quiet strategic consultation then evolved very rapidly, I might add, to ministers level and then to leaders level, right, to summit level. And it took on the mission of providing international public goods. And that has become essentially the organising principle of the Quad for the last few years. Now, my argument is that given the political change, let's put it in neutral terms, given the political change that we've seen in the last few months, I would argue that the Quad has the capacity to evolve further and probably has the imperative to evolve further. Much in the same way that we've already heard other speakers say, it will evolve and could even get more salient as a feature of its members' foreign policies if it harnesses and acts upon each member's strategic interests, right? and if it harnesses and plays upon where those strategic interests converge, where they are shared interests. I would argue that whereas previously those shared interests aligned very much on this provision of international public goods, we now have a political environment, especially from Washington, where that is difficult. Agreement on the provision of international public goods is now more difficult than it previously was. And I would argue, and have argued, this is a personal opinion only, that if there is anything that these four countries can agree on, it is the importance of maintaining strategic stability in the Indo Pacific. And so my argument, if you take nothing else away from this session, it should be that strategic convergence should be the kernel of how the Quad evolves. This is my personal argument, and that is not only critically important for the Indo-Pacific region and for global security, but also that is where the four countries are most likely to agree.
Thanks, Arzan. I think your thesis of the Quad playing a role in the strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific, quite similar to the ambassador's reference at the beginning of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific, the Quad being a framework to achieving that. So it does sound like there's alignment there. In saying that, the answers, while you all clearly are supporters of the Quad, there are issues that Raji, you describe as being of temporary turbulence. Ambassador, I suppose to a certain extent, Tokyo, we're all a little bit envious of Tokyo, at least the public position, because you are almost watching on as there are tensions in the Delhi-Washington relationship, tariffs, and over the issues related to Pakistan, the issues that we've had in recent times between Canberra and Washington, or even the concern or anxiety that Australia has in relation to AUKUS. Do you see Tokyo perhaps as being at the moment a solidifying force, holding the group together, a role perhaps of ensuring that the other three countries don't forget the stabilising force that the Quad needs to be?
Yeah. On that question of whether Japan is a solidifying force, my answer is yes, but not alone. While Japan and Australia together have long strengthened the regional frameworks such as APEC, ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, and TPP, CPTPP, we have both served as a facilitator of regional cooperation. I believe Japan and Australia will continue to do so for the Quad, and I personally think that engaging India is essential. India is the world's largest democracy and will remain so throughout the 21st century. By the year 2100, UN projected that India will have over 1.5 billion people. You know, in the past, APEC started in 1989 to promote regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific, with the first summit held in 1993, with over 35 years of history. APEC still plays an important role here, as we will all see at the summit in Korea this October. At the same time, under the Indo Pacific concept, the only existing regional cooperation framework is the Quad. It is the only framework in this region that includes India. Indo Pacific is vital for the economic development of the 21st century, so it is extremely important to engage India and steadily advance practical cooperation, step by step even, but over the long term in this century. Working with India and together with the United States, the world's largest economy today, and with Japan and Australia, will be vital in realizing free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no doubt that Japan has played that central role plenty of times before, and you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan, with support of Australia and others, definitely held it together. Hopefully the US doesn't make the same decision with the Quad that it did with the TPP. You've got your own, even though you are publicly, I suppose, not in the same position that Australia and India is with the US. You've got some very interesting domestic issues at the moment. Can you provide, I suppose, a level of reassurance, Ambassador, that no matter what happens with the change of prime ministership that is coming up in coming days, that the view on the Quad will stand no matter who is leader?
Well, that's a very interesting, tricky question. Well, first, it may not be well known, but Prime Minister Modi visited Japan at the end of August, just a couple of weeks ago, and spent 2 full days in talks with the Prime Minister Ishiba, and they even traveled together by Shinkansen to Miyagi Prefecture, the bread train. During the visit, the two leaders reiterated their commitment to advance cooperation among the like-minded countries through frameworks such as Quad, and welcome the Quad evolution into a vital and enduring regional groupings. And then they looked forward to the next Quad summit hosted in India later this year. And so far, I have no negative comment on the Quad from any of the Japanese political leader contesting to the next Prime Minister of Japan. So I believe Japan's commitment to the Quad will not change.
Right, super. Yeah. And look, it did come across as a very successful meeting. Raji and I were talking about during the week, something like 180 MOUs signed. Yeah. That sounds like a lot of work for people to do. Raji, you interested in something you said in your intro. You mentioned India's role in a couple other groupings. The ambassador has said how important the Quad grouping is regionally, including because India is a part of it. We've been reminded this year almost how important India is for the Quad. We have a situation where India is also a participant in BRICS. It is also a participant in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Yet the perception, at least, is amongst the establishment and the national security community is that India views its role in the Quad as most significant. Could you maybe take the audience through how can we have that situation where India is such an important maritime democracy, as the ambassador said, part of the solidifying force of stability in the Indo Pacific, as Arzan has said, how India can simultaneously participate in the BRICS and SCO and still help in what you described as a need to counter the worst that Beijing can throw at us?
Yeah, absolutely. So India does engage with BRICS, RIC, the Russia, India, China grouping, as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But I think these three entities, at least, they are very different from the Quad for a variety of reasons. And other minilaterals that have come about, they're all very, very different. So, sorry. I think for India, it made sense to join BRICS, RIC, and even SCO at some point in the past, in the early 2000s, because it made sense because these were all talking about making the global institutions much more representative, sort of having a better say, especially in the economic multilateral institutions. World Bank and IMF reforms were talked about. Multipolarity was another key theme in each of these groupings. So at the end of the Cold War, in the beginning of the 2000s, when these groupings were kind of taking shape, it did make sense for India to be part of these groupings along with Russia and China. But today, I don't think they any longer serve the Indian interests, because Indian interests have evolved, have changed significantly over the last two and a half decades, in a sense. India's interests lie increasingly with the US and US partners, Australia, Japan being some of the closest partners. One another Indo Pacific partner that India is very close to and has had a trusted relationship is France. Again, these are some of the new partnerships, partners that will continue to be important for India in a sense. So I think the fact that India does continue to, so SCO was a very interesting case. SCO really did not form along with the RIC and the BRICS. SCO India wanted to be a part of it in order to kind of check as to what the China-related agenda is getting shaped up in these kind of forums. And to some extent, even BRICS, RIC, none of these groupings, India is engaged as much because it serves India's interests, but India is keen to be there and not really get out of these groupings because India want to keep a check on the kind of agenda that is increasingly shaped by both Beijing and Moscow. If you look into the longer-term national interests, Russia is not going to be a willing partner for India when countering China. Russia is not the partner. So that's where I go back to, even when I look at the troubled phase that India-US relationship is going through at this moment. And there have been plenty of commentary that I've talked about as to how Trump administration has managed to destroy the trust that has been created over the last 25 years. That might be true. Maybe there is some damage being done to the relationship. Even if that were the case, I would still say Russia and China are not India's options in countering China, in managing India's problems in the Indo Pacific. For that, you have to look at, maybe the US and India will go through some bit more trouble phase, but even so, I would say Russia and China are not its partners, and therefore the need to look at other minilaterals. India has been sort of very comfortable with the minilaterals that have come about. The Quad is, of course, the most prominent one, but I think there are many more minilaterals that have taken shape in this region, and all with the idea of getting more endorsement in terms of getting the concept of Indo-Pacific endorsed by a large number of countries, and also the concept of what China means, China's belligerent actions. What are the strategic consequences of China's rise, and what that means for the regional stability in a sense. So I think getting more and more countries endorsed in that sense through minilateral groupings, I think that's a great way to go about, even for India in a sense.
I do like the description of a reason why India is in a couple of those other groups is to check or monitor versus the substance of the Quad. The Ambassador Raji mentioned the still hope or expectation that there will be a Quad leaders in India in November. Do you? I think you're more doubtful that might occur if I've understood your view on it. But do you think that not having a Quad leaders, if it doesn't pan out that way, does that matter? Is it, again, just part of the temporary turbulence? Or if we don't have a Quad leaders in India this year, that actually then will you begin to say, well, we might have a problem?
No, it would be always great to not miss the leader level summit. And Quad is, a lot of other countries are watching with a lot of interest, excitement, and also hoping that this would fail. This experiment is going to go through a second failure in a sense. So many countries are waiting to cheer on such an outcome in a sense. And again, I would want to believe that that is not going to be the case, and there will be a leader level summit. But I'm also kind of pragmatic because we are now in October almost, and we don't have very much time left to plan. There was a lot of hope that there could be on the sidelines of the UNGA, there would be a summit that might happen, but that did not really come through. So I'm less hopeful of a leader level summit that might happen this year. But again, that does not mean that this is going to be a serious problem, a challenge for the Quad. And I think that's where I look at the informal nature of the Quad as being an advantageous thing. There is a lot of flexibility because many have criticized that, oh, Quad is just an informal grouping. It doesn't even have a secretariat. Yeah, you can say that, yeah, that's a problem, that's a challenge. If you want to criticize, that's one way to look at it. But I also look at it as a grouping that has a lot more flexibility and a flexibility to respond to a lot of evolving set of challenges, changes that are coming about. We are all going through some testing times in this part of the world, for sure. And I think Quad being an informal setup in that sense. And maybe at some level, we need to come to an understanding that Quad leader level summit may not happen on an annual basis. I'm fine with it. And instead, I would say, let's institute and get in most number of stakeholders involved in this process. Right now, you have a foreign minister level meetings that happen on a regular basis. Maybe let's start with a defense ministers dialogue on a fairly regular basis. Maybe bring in the home affairs into this in this bed. Maybe even science and technology. There are a whole range of mechanisms that you can try to. So what you're doing is, in a sense, you're expanding the number of stakeholders in the process who have a stake in managing and making sure that the Quad survives and thrives. So not just surviving. So I think, so I'm not entirely pessimistic at the fact that there is not going to be a Quad summit that might not happen, but there are other ways to continue to energize Quad, strengthen Quad in ways that we are not doing at the moment.
Very good. It's an interesting one. We might come back to it later, or Lavina and Arzan might like to tackle it in the course of their next answers. But Lavina's point of maybe needing to go back to the reason why the Quad exists, whether that's consistent with your view that actually expansion to other areas might be necessary for that, whether that's in conflict or actually complementary. Your reference to potentially the need for Quad to expand to defence and defence ministers. A good segue for me to go to both Lavina and Arzan with effectively the same question. Some of the Quad nations, Australia being one, almost go out of their way to say that the Quad is not a defence grouping, not even a security grouping, that it's for the positive capacity building side of regional development. So I'm keen to explore this interplay with you and potentially whether there's a public rhetoric versus what actually happens in meetings in private. But both of you recently wrote co-authored a Hoover Institute essay with a couple of other leading experts, including the likes of Stacey Pettijohn at CNAS. I recommend everyone take a read of it. It's titled Mobilising for a Free, Open and Secure Indo Pacific, a Strategic Reassessment, in which the authors consider the threats to regional security in the Indo Pacific and the role that the Quad could play in deterrence, which very much goes to what Raji was talking about in terms of the role for defence. So, Lavina, maybe starting with you, with the reticence that some Quad nations have in expanding the grouping into the role of defence, can you maybe take us through the findings of your report, the role you envisaged the Quad could play in deterrence, and in particular, one of the lines that immediately struck me in the report was that there was no holding back from Lavina and team. It specifically says that the report, that the authors came together to raise the alarm, not simply be alert, not alarmed. It was to be alarmed. So, Lavina, take us through the report and what it means for the Quad.
Right. Look, I think you're right to segue from, the Quad has been all about public goods and reassuring the region that China's narratives about it are untrue. So it's not an anti-China containment strategy, it's not a NATO. So our paper that we've written, I hope all of you have a chance to read it. It's only 10 pages, it's not that long. But it was written with the purpose of, when you say raising the alarm, but providing a strategic assessment of the risks of conflict in our region. So it is focused on that risk of major power conflict, not on grey zone deterrence or grey zone conflicts, but on major power conflict. And we focused, we came together for 3 days in Stanford, and we hashed out what we thought would be the primary flashpoints, likely triggers for major conflict. And we think that, yes, South China Sea, East China Sea, North Korean Peninsula are all possible flashpoints, but that Taiwan is the major flashpoint that we need to be worried about. Now, we all know that the military balance in the Indo-Pacific is narrowing, and that when it comes to the Taiwan Strait, that it is China that has an advantage in terms of being able to concentrate its forces more quickly and with more mass, then we are able to intervene. So the trick for Taiwan, or the problem for Taiwan, is to hold out as long as possible until others can come to the scene. So for China, it has that advantage. It also has more mass when it comes to munitions, strike weapons. We know about the theatre missile gap in the Indo Pacific, and this is a real gap. So the call to arms is primarily about the fact that China has more munitions, more long-range strike options. It can bring its forces much faster into the theatre than we can do. We have less munitions and more targets. China has more munitions and less targets. And so now is the time to really be considering what can we do now to deter a major conflict in our region. So if we're thinking about major disruption to our lives and livelihoods, it is that risk of major conflict. So when we thought about deterrence, because we were primarily initially thinking about the Quad, and the Quad, as we know, some of us are allies of the United States, some are not. Some have intelligence arrangements with the United States, some do not. We have different, disparate geographic priorities and interests, but a common core interest in ensuring a balance in the Indo-Pacific. So when we thought about deterrence, we are thinking, all right, if there is a Taiwan conflict, it is about firstly bringing or being able to show that we are capable of bringing our forces into the theatre quickly and that we can intervene, and introducing that risk and possible cost to China, that it won't be a short, sharp war. And the second aspect is that we could horizontally escalate, that there will be more parts of the theatre in the Indo-Pacific that come into play, and that we are in it for the long haul and have the capability to actually fight in a protracted war. So to be clear, we're not suggesting that we want to fight a protracted war, but to deter China, we have to tell them or show them that, one, we're willing to, but also that we actually have the capability to. And that's the problem at the current state of affairs, is that China has the ability to fight a protracted war. Yes, it does have vulnerabilities, but when it comes to military industrial production, military supply chains, we are at a real disadvantage. We have been enjoying the fruits of the post-Cold War peace dividend, and we are slow to respond to these changing circumstances in our region. And so if we are to be thinking about deterrence seriously, we need to actually build the capability to fight protracted wars, thinking about industrial production. So I'm going to leave Arzan to talk about the next, how do you do it? Yeah, I'll leave it to Arzan.
No, it's. I think it's the perennial problem that when you talk about these issues, you have to be, unfortunately, talking about how to avoid war or deter war. You've got to be prepared for it. Yeah. And too often people will say, "Oh, well, you're talking about war, therefore you're a warmonger."
Yes.
But if you don't prepare, then you're not going to have the deterrence. Arzan, Lavina set it out pretty well, but in terms of the deterrence, the paper was pretty clear that a coordinated approach was absolutely vital. Is that what bound you guys to come together?
Yeah. I think it's really important as a first step, as the premise of this discussion, to understand what we're talking about. Because we often talk about war and we kind of gloss over it and we say it quickly and it's a short word. But the kind of conflict that we are talking about, a major power conflict in the Indo-Pacific, meaning ultimately, most likely, between China and the United States, that's the scenario we're talking about, would be so unprecedented in its calamity. And it would be such a catastrophe that it is beyond the imagination, I think, of most people in our countries. It is such a grave threat. even if you don't think that the risk of it is very high or the probability of it is very high, it is going to be such a calamitous event, should it occur, that it is an extremely high-risk problem. Right? Now, if that's the case, if you accept that, now you have to imagine the absolute worst case scenario of that conflict, then the way we think to deter it is essentially through mobilization. Right? The first word of our report is mobilizing. Mobilizing for a free, open and secure Indo-Pacific. Because, again, as Lavina said, the key is to introduce enough uncertainty in the mind of the adversary or the aggressor that they do not think they can use military force and get away with it, that their objectives will be denied both operationally and strategically, and that the only way to create that uncertainty is to deliver credible signals, including with facts on the ground, that show that these countries in the region have the resolve and the capacity, as Lavina said, to fight this war. In order to do that, though, if you follow the logic, in order to send that credible signal, the United States cannot do it alone. Right? We've all grown up in a world where the United States has been the hegemon, the superpower, the unipolar pole, right? But this is a problem so grave that the United States cannot do it alone, and it needs partners, right? And it is in the partners' national interests, in Australia's individual national interests, in India's individual national interests, and in Japan's individual national interests to embark on this process of mobilization as well. Now, some of that can be done under the rubric of the Quad, but it doesn't have to be all done under the rubric of the Quad. A lot of it requires actually just individual mobilization in these countries. Or a lot of it requires coordination that can be bilateral or trilateral. And even if it's quadrilateral, it doesn't have to be under the formal mechanisms of the Quad if that makes some people uncomfortable. Right? The key is the mobilization and the mobilization of these countries coordinating together. Why? Why does the Quad even matter? Yeah, we've talked about shared interests. I get that, and I don't dispute it. But when we're talking about deterrent effects, the reason these four countries matter is because they have advantageous geography, because they have economic and technological power, more than most others in the region, and because they have capable militaries. And so to leverage those assets of these four countries to coordinate their activities, that is the form of mobilization that is probably the only thing that will be sufficient to introduce enough uncertainty in the mind of the aggressor. And that's why we argue that mobilization and coordination to achieve that mobilization is necessary for deterrence.
Excellent, well said. Definitely a call to arms from both of you. I do encourage people to read it. We've got lots of people in the room, government, public servants, industry, great European missions. So questions from the audience. We've got one straight down in the front here, but we've got some microphones that might run the room.
Thanks, Justin.
And maybe tell the panel that they several will know who you are, but tell the panel so
I'm
that
Bill
they know.
Patterson. I'm the former Australian ambassador to Korea and have a long-term association with ASPI as well. The weak point in this argument, we've talked about pressure on allies to step up and that this will create deterrence, a level of deterrence that perhaps doesn't exist. But this week, as we meet, the US is talking a new national defense strategy. Pete Hegseth has called, the Secretary of War, has talked about giving a speech focusing very much on the homeland. Now, the US Indo Pacific Command is clearly focused on building capability in the Indo Pacific, but it's not clear, it seems to me, that the US administration is as fully committed to this as possible. I've also just been back in Korea. If as part of this homeland focus, the US, and because of tariff issues and other things, the US were to reduce the troop levels in Korea. This will send massive alarm through Korea, precipitate, I think, a crisis between Korea and the United States. Korea itself is, whilst it's not part of the Quad, it is also extremely reluctant, particularly under the new administration in Korea, to be drawn into strategic flexibility, becoming, if you like, drawn into a Taiwan conflict. So it's all very well to talk about these things, but it seems to me we may face an unsettled Indo-Pacific approach amongst the Quad partners, driven, in fact, because there is no settled US Indo-Pacific policy under the present administration. But I'd be interested in views on that.
Thanks, Bill. Who on the panel would like to tackle the US end about how the changes to US domestic policy might impact the Quad and more broadly than the Quad, the Indo-Pacific?
I'm happy to give it a go, but please pile on. Look, you're absolutely right that the political change in the US, and we say this pretty explicitly in our paper, is part of the reason why we judge the risk of major war is increasing, okay? Because our judgment is that for a whole host of reasons, right, the NDS leak is a significant indicator. We don't know how it will eventually shake out, but it's one of many indicators that suggests that US policy is now more narrowly focused on mercantilist gains, it's more volatile, it's unpredictable, et cetera, right? We got that, and that's why we judge that the foundations of the US-led deterrence structure in the region is weak or weaker than it previously was. So that is a problem, I grant you. However, what we're arguing is that especially given that fact, it is in the interests of countries like Australia and India and Japan, setting aside the United States, it is in our national interests and in the collective interests of all of these countries to embark on actions, whether it is deepening bilateral relations between, for example, Australia and Japan or India and Japan, as we've heard, in order to either offset that political volatility in the US or at least to buttress it, right? There are many other sort of ways to paint a happier picture on this. One is that, listen, sometimes uncertainty is actually good for deterrence because you never know, because Beijing will not know how the United States reacts. I'm not confident enough to place my eggs in that basket. But the final thing I would say is that this is no longer a hub and spoke architecture. This is not an architecture that depends on the United States leading and convening everything, right? We've seen over the past decade that countries like Australia and India and Japan can work bilaterally and trilaterally, and I think that is, we have no option but to do that, right? We cannot wait for a more predictable administration in the United States, and nor can, for that matter, nor can Indo-PACOM, all right? We all have to just crack on with it.
Yeah.
Lavina
sorry,
and
Raji.
Raji, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think, look, I've also read some of the articles about the leaks from the National Security Strategy. So, sure, it's worrying if that is a refocus. At the same time, you're receiving other signals from the administration. There are many members of the administration who talk about directly competition with China being the number one primary objective of the United States. If it's going to remain retain its primacy, it can't afford to just exit from the Indo-Pacific and say, yep, China, you can have that part. We'll just stick to the Northern Hemisphere. So I would just say I'm introducing a bit of caution into how we interpret what's to come. Secondly, I think also we have to remember our own agency, and I think that's coming back to this idea of the importance of allies. So at the moment, we're all in a bit of a state of flux. We're not sure what the United States' intentions are towards all of us. I think it's clear that they are wanting all allies to share the burden. And I would say if you did the counterfactual, if you took the United States out, where would we be? As Australians, as Japanese, South Koreans, we would be doing a lot of the same things that we are advocating in our report. We now rely on the United States for a lot of our defence production, military production. If we didn't have that ability to rely on them, we would be forced to do more ourselves. So all that we're advocating is essentially to become more self-sufficient, but in aggregate, we are contributing to deterrence. And when I'm going slightly back to this idea of agency, I think it is really important that all allies right now, at this point in time, are the strongest advocates for alliances to the United States. That the alliances are an incredibly powerful thing that China doesn't have, that we have. So trying to reinforce that over and over again in meetings with the President and other high-level leaders within the administration is really important.
Yeah, your paper sets out very clearly that China doesn't like collectives, groupings, whether it be AUKUS, Quad, Squad, whatever it might be. Raji, you've got a view?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring in a slightly different perspective into it. I think we have been looking at this kind of various scenarios we have looked at in a sense for a long time, at least for the last 10 years. Even when Obama administration was in office, whether there was going to be an isolationist US that might come into play. And I think those were the kind of scenarios that you looked at in the past, and therefore you have also given way to new unilateral groupings without the US. And this was at that point of time when we were looking at it, not to discount the importance of the US, but to look at a scenario where the US may not be there and you have to pick up the task in a sense, and therefore build up your own kind of capabilities. And none of these are going to be easy. None of these are going to be easy because we are used to certain ways of working with our allies and allied partners and kind of thing, and especially when it comes to involving India, which is not a security partner with the US, and it's always been sensitive to how deeper a security collaboration it can have with the US and US allied partners. There are going to be tricky issues. It's going to be a tricky phase in a sense. But I think here is the need for politically conscious decisions to work with partners that we are not habitually working with in the past. And I think if we can start focusing on some of those partnerships, unilateral partnerships that have come around in the Indo Pacific, I think that can be hugely beneficial when the US might be going through a phase of distancing itself from the Indo Pacific and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Ambassador, please.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, just saying a little bit in a different manner than what Raji has said. Long-term trajectory of this century, I think, for the United States is the Asia pivot. So that's really the fundamentals. But what is also happening today is that there's really the big challenge as a result of the war in Ukraine and Middle East. The international order based on the rule of law is really threatened. So we really need to have a multifaceted approach, just like a unilateral is one. We have currently Japan, US, Australia, Philippines, defense ministers meeting, and there's also trial for create the Japan, Australia, Korea, or the Asia Pacific 4 is another one. So those are the really approach that we really have to create and face in order to have this turbulent and a little bit complicated Indo-Pacific situation.
Thanks, Ambassador. We might take a couple of questions together with the mics, including from our Quad Plus partner here, and then Manaho over there. But we might hear the questions first, and then, given time, might let you choose which question to answer.
Thank you. My name is Arto Haape. I'm the ambassador of Finland in Canberra. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about India and where India is. And Raji said that China and Russia cannot be the sort of long-term partners for India. Justin will remember that we had the External Affairs Minister of India in Canberra in November last year. at the Rising and Down Under dialogue, and he gave a very interesting, he made a really interesting point in his remarks. He said that there are 3 big countries in Asia, India, China, and Russia. And it's in India's interest to make sure that none of these 3 becomes too disadvantaged, and that it's in the interest of these countries to make sure that Russia has enough flexibility when it's looking to be more engaged with Asia. Now, of course, hearing this with European ears and Finnish ears, that was something that I immediately took note of with keen interest. I would be just interested in hearing, also taking into account Prime Minister Modi's recent appearance in Beijing. How do you see India's long-term trajectory when it comes to most important partners? Thank you.
All right, with that easy question, Raji, give you time to think about the answer.
Hi, I'm Manohar Thiagaraj with BAE Systems. I've run our offices in Taiwan and Korea, most recently returning from South Korea. The question I have is also related to the NDS. In particular, if there is a Quad -1, and I'm not saying that'll happen, right? But the 3 remaining Quad partners, what security goods could they reasonably deliver if the US deprioritizes the Indo Pacific? And here I'm specifically referring to, I've heard the thread mentioned about industrial capacity. The name missing from that is, of course, Korea, because Korea is a mess now of producing defensive articles at scale. Japan will also do so. So how feasible is it to coordinate industrial capacities at this scale, especially given national boundaries around the defense industry are so stark? It's very hard to coordinate industrial strategies. How can we have integrated deterrence around industrial capacity when national boundaries are so stark?
Thanks, Manohar. Raji, do you want to take the ambassador's question?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador, for that tricky question. But to me, it seems like if India has to look at the longer-term prospect of, I think this was about 2 or 3 years ago when the Indian Chief of Defense Staff came out with a statement saying that China is India's #1 national security threat. To me, it seems like then your options are pretty clear, that who are your partners who are going to stand with you in managing that particular threat. It doesn't seem like Russia is your partner. It doesn't seem like many countries in the neighborhood may have interest, but they don't have the capacity, capability, willingness, and range of things. Therefore, it seems like the US and other new security partners of India, which is Australia, Japan, the Quad partners, France, these are the countries that can be India's new security. And I think these are pretty clear to India at some level. I think that's where, especially in the last 2 months, this has become pretty clear. Because I think India was riding on a high for a while now, especially after the G20's successful summit, and also the whole range of other successes. But I think recently there have also been the last 2 months developments have been pretty rude awakening for India. And I think that's because I think even when the Trump administration was coming into office, I think the New Delhi was very happy about it, because I think here is going to be a government that is not going to be really talking about the state of the democracy or how well are you, how free are your media, is the Indian media, and whole range of things. So none of those uncomfortable questions were going to be asked. So India was pretty happy about the return of a Trump administration, and he thought this was going to be a great phase in US-India relationship. But of course, I think, and I think to many, it seemed like quite a shock as to the kind of trajectory it has taken suddenly in the US-India relation. And the main trigger point, of course, was the India-Pakistan recent conflict in May, and the fact that India completely outrightly rejected Trump's claim that he really mediated and brought about the conflict to an end. I think that was the tricky point for it. That really hurt the relationship in a sense. But I think anybody who has dealt with India for a while would know that this is a sensitive issue. And it was always very clear to every US administration that, and others, that the US has always played an important role in managing the India-Pakistan conflicts, but they've always played a discrete role. They did not really stand on the rooftop and make an announcement that I was the one who mediated and so on and so forth. So I think there was a difference in how Trump treated this whole issue, and that really became. So again, I would say this is a tough phase India is going through, but despite the SCO summit meetings and on the sideline, India had the meetings with Putin and Xi Jinping, but it's very, very clear that India really does not have a longer-term prospect of building closer partnership with both of those countries. Again, I think US-led partnerships will continue to be the core, will continue to be the major sort of pillars of India's strategy in managing China, as well as the sort of ensuring that there is regional stability and so on and so forth.
Raji, very quickly, it might help the ambassador and the audience if you can a minute burst on history here with India that. Coming towards the late 90s, if we think there were issues now between India and the US, there were issues between India and the US. So we've come a long way, and perhaps it's a reassuring statement again, going back to one of Raji's earlier comments, Ambassador, about the different reasons that India is in those different groups, even though our countries might simply not see the rationality of being part of BRICS or SCO. There may very well be that rationale.
Because I think nobody really questions even the rationale or primary purpose of the Quad or other minilateral groupings that have come about in a sense. Nobody in India really questions that. They do clearly see that being the primary sort of primary pillars of India's strategy going forward. And nobody has worried, even under a Trump administration, that the Quad may not be the Quad, or the US-led partnerships are not going to be the answer to India's continuing challenges with China and others in the region.
Lavina, Arzan, who wants to take the industrial question?
Arzan was going to give it a go. He just said it wasn't me.
I've been voluntold. Yeah, look, you are absolutely right with the premise of your question, right? Coordination on industrial capacity and defense industrial bases is very difficult. Got it, and agree with that. However, it's not a matter of being zero. It's not a matter of being impossible. And we've got recent examples involving, for example, Japan and Australia, of opportunities to either co-develop or co-produce at least major weapon systems. When Modi goes to Tokyo, there are opportunities for, in the future, co-development or co-production of various weapon systems. I take your point, though, that broader defense industrial base integration is difficult, and perhaps that should not be the aim point, right? Our call to arms, if you will, is for individual countries to mobilize their own DIBs, their own defense industrial bases, right? If there is coordination to be had, then that would make that mobilization all the more efficient and effective, and that's a good thing. But it is not the minimum that we are looking for. The minimum that we are calling for is mobilization. I would also say, when the sort of opening of your question was, you know, what security goods can these countries provide? It's not only about defense industrial base, right? We would argue, and we have argued in the paper, that there are forms of operational coordination that countries can undertake, ideally with the United States, alongside the United States, but not necessarily alongside the United States. And so, for example, in the paper we talk about the necessity of developing the enabling foundations of military cooperation, which are mission agnostic, right? Which could be used just as easily for HADR operations as they could for conventional military operations. And that is a form of coordination that we think is eminently viable, right? And has been proven in certain other formats. And that's the type of coordination that we think is necessary. So so again, the whole framing, if I can sort of bring it back full circle, the whole framing of, I think, this panel, our work together, is advocacy for a realistic but effective combination of countries, right? And we think, we don't have to aim for integration, or previously we were talking about integration, if not interchangeability of forces, right? That may be apt for certain allies, but that's not required for all partners. What is required for all partners is mobilization and a minimum level of coordination.
I think that with the timing, I think that's an excellent way to wrap up. I'd only add that in terms of the industrial base, despite what we see publicly, my view is that's what AUKUS is doing. It's helping the US industrial base. Yep. We've just had a decision relating to Australia's future frigates with the Mogami decisions. That's Australia and Japan working together. I think I agree, particularly with comments from Raji and Lavina around the Quad needing to work on defence as well, getting out of just being viewed as a capacity builder and lean in to what we can really do together. All the comments around Korea as well, the range of countries that can add to that collective. But thank you all for coming on your way home, hopefully. But put your hands together for what I think is a really informative panel.